yesterday's attacks and other things.
Some say that he does have ties to Muslim extremists. I don't know.
On July 14, 2015, Iran and 6 major world powers reached a historic deal, lifting sanctions imposed by the United States, European Union and United Nations, in return for Iran agreeing to long-term curbs on its nuclear program. But the practical results of the deal were rather short-lived, as then Donald Trump pulled his country out of the agreement in May 2018 to reimpose economic sanctions on Tehran. In October 2020, Trump told his supporters in the heat of his presidential campaign that his first call after winning the second term would be from Iranian leaders asking to make a new deal.
They cannot have a nuclear weapon. They cannot have a nuclear weapon. But I want them to be good. I want them to be strong. I want them to have a great country. The first call will be Iran. As soon as we win, they're going to call and we'll make a deal.
Trump did not survive the presidential election, so on January 20, 2021, the inauguration day of the new US President Joe Biden, Iranian President Hassan Rouhani called on the incoming US administration to come back to the 2015 nuclear agreement and lift sanctions on Tehran as part of the Americans' commitment under the deal.
توپ امروز در زمین آمریکا و واشنگتن هست. اگر برعمل کنند به تعهدات، ما هم به تعهدات خودمون عمل میکنیم. ترامپ مرد، زندگی سیاسیش تمام شد و برجام زنده موند. این تمام تلاشش این بود که برجام رو از بین ببره و ناموفق بود، نتونست.
Until quite recently, Tehran and the Biden administration were at loggerheads over which side should move first to revive the nuclear agreement, with Tehran demanding Washington first lift sanctions, as it was Washington that had withdrawn from the deal, and Washington calling on Tehran first to resume compliance with the deal.
We are very clear-eyed that remain. These talks will be structured around working groups that the EU is going to form with the remaining partners in the JCPOA, including Iran. And the primary issues that will be discussed are the nuclear steps that Iran would need to take in order to return to compliance with the JCPOA, and the sanctions relief steps the United States would need to take in order to return to compliance as well. We don't anticipate presently that there will be direct talks between the United States and Iran through the process, though we certainly remain open to them.
The new rounds of talks in Vienna, however, boosted hopes for the revival of the Moraband deal, with the aim of reaching an agreement in 2 months.
I think it was constructive and in the right track. It's too soon to say that that would be known after the work of the working groups. But of course we are hopeful. If we were not hopeful, we would have not been here. We would move based on our own policies.
While top diplomats talked about progress in the negotiations, an informed source had another story for Press TV, that things didn't look good enough and the bone of contention was not just over who should take the first step. On April 21st, a briefing with a senior State Department official on recent US engagement in Vienna regarding the JCPOA was hardly more than what the source had already told Press TV. According to the senior State Department official, there still are disagreements and, in some cases, pretty important ones, on our respective views about what is required to what is meant by a return to full compliance. The official added, "And the distance that remains to be travelled is greater than the distance that we've travelled so far. So we're not near the conclusion of these negotiations. The outcome is still uncertain." Acknowledging that the negotiation was already a complicated one, the official made it clear that Washington will not lift all sanctions, as it was supposed to do under the nuclear deal, adding that the Americans have provided Iran with a number of examples of the kind of sanctions that they would need to lift in order to come back into compliance. The sanctions they would not lift as part of a return into compliance with the JCPOA, and a third category, the sanctions the Trump administration deliberately and avowedly imposed purely for the purpose of preventing or hindering a return to the compliance with the JCPOA. The Biden administration says that it cannot remove these sanctions and needs to go through every sanction to make sure whether they were legitimately or illegitimately imposed. After all direct and indirect talks and negotiations, the two sides are back to square one as the American side insists on sequencing the removal of sanctions and the Iranian side insists on the removal of all sanctions at once. Washington says a sequence in which the US does everything before Iran does nothing is not an acceptable sequence. As for the Iranians' insistence on getting a written guarantee from the US that a future administration will not abandon the deal as the Trump administration did, Washington says it's clear there is no such thing as a guarantee. It's not something that the US can or will give. This is a political understanding that relies on the good faith of all actors.
تنها پیش شرط ایران تعهدات برجامی خودش لغو یک جای همه تحریم ها و سپس راستی آزمایی اون توسط ایران هست. در غیر این صورت ایران همین مسیر اقدامات مقابله خودش رو مبتنی بر قانون مصوب مجلس شورای اسلامی ادامه خواهد داد. اگر اروپایی ها بتوانند طرف امریکایی رو مجاب به بازگشت به تعهدات خودشون بکنن، طبیعتاً این نشست ها نتیجه مثبت خواهد داشت. در غیر این صورت به نظر نمیرسه که اتفاق خاصی بیفته.
Just before the briefing with a senior State Department official, the informed source had told Press TV that only the removal of all sanctions together against Iran will save the Vienna talks. It is not acceptable to Iran to divide the sanctions into removable, negotiable. In Tehran, nothing will be accepted but the removal of all sanctions, including those related to the JCPOA, reimposed and relabeled during the Trump era, according to the informed source. The new talks in Vienna came after a terrorist attack on Iran's uranium enrichment facility in Natanz, which put a number of the country's first-generation machines out of order. Both the US and the Europeans kept silent on the attack and instead expressed concerns over Iran's 60% enrichment, which the country launched for the first time right after the sabotage. In a surprise move, the European Union recently imposed sanctions on Iranians, including the head of the Islamic Revolution Guards Corps. Tehran says the EU sanctions are meant to undermine Iran's position in Vienna negotiations, or the negotiations altogether. All in all, it seems that Western sides of the negotiation are dragging their feet, with no real intention to revive the Iran nuclear deal. So far, the initial hope has vaporized, and by the looks of things, there is no light at the end of the tunnel. The American side that unilaterally withdrew from the deal is not prepared to give a guarantee that it will not do the same in the future, is not prepared to verify sanctions relief, and despite what it claims, is not willing to make the firm for all the damage the previous administration did to the deal. Iran has made it clear that it will by no means give its consent to a suspension, ceasing, or temporary waiver of the sanctions. The outcome of the Vienna talks is almost nothing, leaving the fate of the JCPOA in limbo.